Though the current incarnation of Saturday Night Live makes no attempts to hide its overtly liberal political leanings, the show struggled with progressive causes in the past. Despite launching the careers of various female comedians over the years, SNL has been lambasted for its male-dominated cast, with many critics and ex-cast members regularly referring to the show as a boys' club. This term has lost some of its power in more recent years as female stars such as Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, and Kate McKinnon have rose to prominence through their tenures on the show. However, the label still has some merit, as SNL rosters have, even to this day, invariably held more men than women. Perhaps more strange though is that even when the show featured a relatively gender-balanced cast, the women still struggled to compete with men for airtime. Take, for example, the 86 to 87 season, which featured a nearly complete rebuilding of the cast from the year prior. The only holdovers from the previous season were Jon Lovitz, Nora Dunn, and Weekend Update host Dennis Miller. To round out the new cast, Lorne Michaels hired then-unknowns Dana Carvey, Jan Hooks, Phil Hartman, and Victoria Jackson. This brought the core cast to a total of 7 members, with a relatively even 4-3 male-female split. This was one of the most balanced casts in terms of gender up until this point. So you would think then that this environment would allow for the female cast members to thrive. However, this was ultimately not the case. So why did these talented women struggle? Well, 2 major factors contributed to this outcome. First was the notable lack of support between the women, and the second was their reliance on the writing staff for their material. Collaboration between these women was a problem even before the new season began. Victoria Jackson recalls in the book Live from New York that she was the one that mentioned hiring Hooks to Michaels. The two had previously worked together on the half-hour Comedy Hour, and Jackson thought that she was a magnificent character actor. However, their relationship was rocky at best, with Jackson stating that personally she pretty much hates my guts, but professionally I thought she was like a genius. Nora Dunn also proved to be especially difficult, and not just among the other females. Jon Lovitz recalls that she would pick a fight. She fought with everybody. However, Dunn's romantic involvement with Lorne meant that the cast members were wary to call her out on her behavior. The problem ultimately came to a head during a meeting in which Jackson vented her anger. She recalls that, "I stood up and told everyone that what was wrong with the show was those 2 women. I pointed to Nora and Jan, and all the things they did. They didn't cooperate in sketches, and they slammed doors in people's faces." By all accounts, the 2 quietly then left the room, and Jackson expressed her disappointment that no one else stood up for her. Dana Carvey then apparently replied, "You didn't hear anyone disagreeing, did you?" And the room then burst into laughter. Jackson later recalls that after that they were afraid of me and didn't mess with me anymore. This backstage drama was no doubt a major hurdle to overcome, but another major issue regarded the writing. Though SNL has always featured a writing staff, most of the successful players on the show have become famous by penning their own characters. Dana Carvey in particular during this era proved to be a master at this craft, writing and creating highly popular recurring characters such as the Church Lady, Hans and Franz, and Garth Algar of Wayne's World. Meanwhile, Hooks, Dunn, and Jackson were all great character actors, but none of them wrote their own material, and were therefore at the mercy of the staff writers to get on air. Lovitz recalls that one benefit of Dunn's relationship with Michaels was that she had her own writer hired for her, Christine Zander. One of Dunn's recurring sketches was the Pat Stevens Show, in which she played a model-turned-actress who interviewed guests and thought that Vogue was serious literature. While the sketches were moderately funny, they didn't quite have the staying power of other recurring bits. Jackson in particular recalls struggling to get exposure. She was ultimately hired because of her quirky comedy routines that were regularly featured on talk shows like The Johnny Carson Show. The Weekend Update format proved to be a decent fit for similar material, as she performed handstand routines as well as her own original poetry, like The Life of a Rug. However, she found that this type of writing didn't transfer to sketch comedy, and she remembers bringing the writers food in hopes of getting more roles. Most of the time, though, she ended up playing variations on the ditzy blonde stereotype. But she also recalls that her male co-stars were often very supportive, stating that Jon Lovitz always tried to help me get in the show, and Kevin and Dana wrote me into Hans and Franz as Roseanne getting liposuction. It's interesting that she cites the Hans and Franz sketch, as it was one of the recurring bits that provided Carvey and Nealon with lots of screen time on the show. In the skit's first episode, the duo introduce themselves as bodybuilders who come from a small village in Austria and have a cousin named Arnold, clearly alluding a connection to bodybuilder and 80s megastar Arnold Schwarzenegger. In his article Pumping Up Masculinity, Mason Allard sums up the concept of the sketches by stating that Nealon and Carvey were then able to mock the emerging chauvinistic ideal of big man masculinity through ironic performance in their sketch comedy. This idea, though, is perhaps ironic in and of itself, as they are making fun of so-called excessive masculinity while appearing on a show that favors males over females. Examining the episode in which Jackson appears as Roseanne is also quite interesting because it highlights another problem she faced on the show. Watching the sketch, it's clear Jackson took the impersonation seriously, as she replicates many of Roseanne's mannerisms quite well. However, the skit itself undermines her ability by instead focusing on the liposuction gag. This calls attention to the fact that Jackson is indeed in a fat suit and reminds viewers that a skinny, beautiful woman is underneath. In her article Recovering Our Sense of Humor, Catherine Kine states that prettiness is always the backdrop of women's comedic performance. This problem plagued the women throughout this era and is reinforced in this sketch when Jackson comes back on stage with the lower half of the suit taken off, proclaiming that she is now a svelte domestic goddess. Despite already being a tough show for female cast members, the following years proved to be even more difficult. Preempting another mass exodus, Michaels attempted to avoid it by overstuffing the cast. By 1991, the cast had ballooned to a whopping 18 players. This not only made it even harder for women to get on the show, but also even some of the newer male cast members encountered the same problem. In a musical cold open featuring Steve Martin, then new cast member Tim Meadows sums up the situation perfectly.
I don't have any lines, I'm not in the show, but something tells me that if I were, I'd be raring to go.
Cast member Julia Sweeney also remarks about how she had been effectively typecasted into her Pat character, exclaiming that
something says not to just do Pat tonight.
a lot of the newer females were effectively wasted during this era, with both Beth Cahill and Siobhan Fallon opting to leave after just one season. They attempted to carve out their own space with the Delta 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 sketch, which starred fellow cast member Melanie Hutzel. Hutzel, who had fared a little bit better with her impressions of Jan Brady of the Brady Bunch, as well as celebrity Tori Spelling, stayed for a couple more years. Ultimately, Lorne's decision to amass a cast of this size backfired. A particularly scathing write-up from Chris Smith headlined a 1994 issue of New York Magazine, in which he called the show, quote, a grim joke. He sums up the cast issue saying that the show that once broke all the rules is now obsessed with maintaining its internal pecking order, from where people sit in meetings to how much airtime new cast members deserve. The environment created more frustration than anything else, and despite Lorne's hopes, most of the cast ended up leaving after the low-rated 94 to 95 season. Unbeknownst to Michaels, this was actually a blessing in disguise, especially in regards to the show's long-standing boys' club image. The rebuilt cast saw the emergence of strong female performers, including Molly Shannon, Sherry O'Terry, and Anna Gasteyer. Gasteyer recalls in an interview with Yale Cohen of The New Yorker that we had so much airtime. Those first 3 years were crazy. It was me, Sherry, and Molly, and every single week each of us had a heavily featured personal character, which by comparison to the men was a lot. These three women proved to be wildly driven, more than willing to work together, and were excellent at writing their own material. And being part of a brand new group meant that they weren't subject to the petty cast hierarchies of the year prior. Ultimately, they led the way for an age of strong female performers on SNL, and the subsequent hiring of lead writer Tina Fey in 1999 marked a significant paradigm shift for gender politics on the show. Some rightly still question the extent to which SNL has achieved gender equality, with Karen Murphy asserting in her article, Is This the Era of the Woman?, that women who write and perform comedy continue to be put forward as evidence that women are funny, which indicates that the issue is no more settled. She has a valid point. The fact that the media still feels the need to qualify that women are funny seems to indicate that the problem isn't fully resolved. Even today, with its relatively close margin, SNL's cast still features more men than women. However, despite this disparity, it's undeniable that the last few decades have seen a sizable increase in the number of incredibly talented women on the show. Many of these women have proved that with hard work, collaboration, and perseverance, they are able to succeed on their own terms.